Communities is devoted to fostering community resilience through bottom-up, locally led initiatives. And one of our main activities is STAR-TIDES, which actually is in its 15th year, but has recently moved to CRASC when CRASC started. STAR-TIDES is a global knowledge sharing network that fosters sustainable resilience. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Aaron, who will introduce our Fireside Chat speakers. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy.
Another dinosaur.
If you're not muted, I ask that you do so. We are getting some feedback from other speakers, or I will ask Kathy to handle the mute functions as well. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. We do have an international audience, and I actually did look at the registration list, and it looks like we've got people in at least 18 countries, which is quite impressive. Again, my name is Aaron Rose. I wear two hats for today's call. One, I am the CEO of Global Tactics. We are a multinational strategic advisory firm, and I also serve on the STAR-TIDES Advisory Board. And we are launching today is our first STAR-TIDES Fireside Chat, and we have two distinguished panelists with us, Dr. David Bray and Dr. Eric Rasmussen. I'm not going to go too deep on their bios. It is quite impressive. You can certainly search for either one of them online, but David is a distinguished fellow of the Simpson Center, and Eric serves as CEO of Infinium, still trying to get that pronunciation right, Humanitarian Systems. And Eric also serves on the STAR-TIDES Advisory Board. And David has been a supporter and involvement with STAR-TIDES programs through the friendship of Lynn Wells for many years. So we're excited to begin this program. Kathy did kind of talk a bit about STAR-TIDES. If anyone knows any experience with the government, everything is a long acronym. And you see some of the points here. STAR-TIDES actually got started with National Defense University over at Fort McNair in Washington, D.C. about 15 years ago. It's an acronym for sharing to accelerate research and transformative innovation for development and emergency support. We are a global knowledge sharing network. And in the consulting world, we call that knowledge management. How do you knowledge? Who knows what and what they know, and then how is that leveraged and deployed in certain circumstances? And we use that to build sustainable resilience in promoting human security, both in the freedom from want and the freedom from fear, and creating life-changing social and economic opportunities. As Kathy mentioned, STAR-TIDES kind of transitioned from NDU over to George Mason University, and it is currently coordinated through the university's Center for Resilient and Sustainable Communities, which is more easily known by its acronym of CRASC. Certainly, I encourage you to go to the star-tides.net website for more information. This is the only kind of commercial you'll have, is that we are volunteer funded. And so if you want to make a tax deductible contribution, certainly encourage you to go to the CRASC website, click on Give, and at the bottom of the page, we ask you to write STAR-TIDES under the additional comments about your gift. So with that said, let's get into the conversation. The notion of resilience and interconnectedness has certainly adapted in the 29, 30 years I've been a business professional, but I don't think it surprises anyone on this call that it certainly is taking on a different meaning in the last 2 years. And if you look at the headlines in the news, just in the United States, about whether you should wear masks, you shouldn't wear masks, how that's being enforced, the definition of resilience is changing, and both from what I call a individual level all the way to family, to community, state, regionally, nationally, and internationally. And those are the different areas that I want to kind of tap into the conversation with both David and Eric. And I think one of which is the notion that the interconnectedness, and which is kind of a new word of saying the globalization, at least politically, has taken more of a negative theme. But we are global. We look at your supply chains and just look at supply chains. But we're not getting away from that. But there certainly is policies being looked at to both how to improve the interconnectedness, how to make certain entities more resilient, and how do we deal with the disruptions going forward. And I'm sure many people are watching the Olympics, and the Summer Olympics are only in Paris 2 weeks away, and you're kind of thinking, how will COVID impact the Summer Olympics in 2 years? And so going forward, that's a question I want to pose, starting with David. In the work you're doing and the experience that you have, what is it that's top of mind that you're seeing that you think the powers that be, and however you want to define that, are not seeing? What is some advice? And then I want to get reactions, and same question to Eric. But David, please go ahead.
So, well, first, thank you, Aaron. Thank you, STAR-TIDES. Really great to be here. And I'll put out some interesting thoughts, some disruptive thoughts that we can engage in conversation and explore together today, which is, if you remember at the late 80s, the early 90s, the Berlin Wall had fallen, supposedly the Soviet Union had ended, and Francis Fukuyama and others said it was the end of history, that basically we had demonstrated that capitalism with a representative democracy was the successful way to organize in the future, and that all other nations going forward would organize in that manner. And I think a funny thing happened on the way towards that end of history. A funny thing happened on the way to globalization, which is we discovered the democratization of technology, which I tell people, the good news is we're democratizing tech. You can do things that were near impossible for any one individual organization to do 30 or 40 years ago. That smartphone in your pocket, it is a multi-int platform that you are able to get for a very cheap price. The next billion people that will get access to that platform will get it for less than $50. But it has more computing power, supposedly, than President Reagan had in the early 80s through the Pentagon. And you're now making it available to everybody for $50. So the democratization of technology, I think, has now thrown into question whether or not the way we organize with a deliberative representative form of government that actually intentionally wants party disagreements, that wants other sides to sort of address the issues and take things on, if that is sufficient to respond to the pace of change associated with the democratization of technology, or if at least in the short term, autocracies win because they don't ask the public what they think. They don't really necessarily care about human rights. They don't necessarily care about, that tech exec. If you're out of line, then you are quietly asked to step aside. And if you don't step aside, then you may be imprisoned, hurt, or killed. And so I think we now need to update the premise and say, how do we approach resilience? How do we approach coexistence? How do we approach working together in an era in which people are now super empowered to do things that only the KGB and the CIA could do 40 years ago? People wonder why there's a rise in disinformation. It's not new. We had this in the 1890s. Pulitzer and Hearst, if you remember yellow journalism, we've been there before. And in fact, I often think that we are, without knowing it, we are in a new Victorian era in which it is peak virtue signaling. It's not what you actually do. It is what you appear to do or someone else claims you've done, whether it's through moral outrage or whatever, And it's very similar to the 1890s, the 1900s. And if you remember the Maine, which may have actually led sort of the US to Spanish-American War. And if you also remember how the Victorian era ended, which was World War I. When things really got real, then virtue signaling got thrown out the window. We'll see if that actually happens. Just last few days, we have Putin saying he is going to pull back forces when in fact he's actually put in 7,000 more troops. But again, peak virtue signaling. And so I think resilience is now complicated because you have actors that have super empowered abilities, either at the individual or organization level. Before COVID, there were 5 companies in the world, you can guess who they were, that in 2017 had a larger valuation than all the revenues of all the world's countries, for the exception of the top 4. And that was before COVID-19. Now with COVID-19, those same 5 companies have seen their stock price at least double. Now some in recent months have actually gone down. I'll let you figure out who that was, but still their stocks have gone up while companies have pretty much stagnated. We could conceivably within the next decade, within even 5 or 6 years, face a world in which 5 companies have a higher valuation than all the world's countries with the exception of the United States and China. What does resiliency look like when those are actors supersized on the stage? When now anybody can spread disinformation because they can get it as a service, they can get ransomware as a service, they can get a botnet as a service. And then they can hold a company hostage or have impacts that are grossly beyond what we ever attributed any individual to be able to do. And what does resiliency look like? And so I would say that I think we need to reconceptualize resiliency in an era in which technology has been democratized. And the good news is what technology taketh away, it also giveth. And I'm sure Eric can actually share some insights about how you can use technology to be more resilient. But I would say that if we thought the arc of history at the end of the 80s and the start of the 90s was that clearly the US had demonstrated the best way to organize, and we didn't need to do anything else, just let history play itself out. I think we are now in a very visible and conscious reminder that history is nowhere near over, and we have to figure out how to upgrade our civil capacity, our civil institutions, and upgrade how we work. Otherwise, we may find that we were actually the short-term blip in terms of representative democracy with free market in terms of history, and something else will take our place. And on that optimistic note, I'll hand it over to my colleague, Eric, to pick up the baton.
Who is so tempted for the sake of the fireside chat to say, oh, David, nonsense, come on now. But actually, I agree with most of what you said. Aaron, did you want to interject something before I started?
Yeah, if I may, because there's 2 things, Eric, I would like to get your response to all of that. But as I'm listening to David, I reminded of the scene from one of the James Bond movies. I think it was GoldenEye, when they're saying, and it's ironic, it was about Russia, of course, and there was this explosion at a facility in I guess Siberia, and they're in the London security offices, and they're waiting for the live satellite to come on, and I think M makes the reference that Pierce Brosnan, James Bond says, we don't have to wait to get our information from CNN. And because I'm reminded of that when David talks about the democratization of technology, and also, you see the terms, the de-Westernization of technology. So those are the things that, and again, Eric, I know, I'm assuming you're going to touch on what this other initiative you're involved in, which is the Worldwide Human Geography Data Working Group, because anyone that looks at Google Maps, it's, I'm able to get images from my computer or my phone of things that I could never imagine I would ever have access to. And so it has, just for, Joe Schmo, sitting in a room, have access to tremendous amounts of information. So I want to pose that to you in your response, Eric, is that how has the access of data both improved, and also because more data could also mean more noise, how is it also hindrance the ability to build resilience in different ecosystems?
So it's a complex question, but on a practical level, 2 things. One, yesterday I was approached by somebody who wanted to do some work with me And I did not recognize who they were. So I went out on Google Earth and went down to Street View and found that their business address was a small post office box like place that rents a business site for $56 a month. And that didn't encourage me. And it kind of altered the tone of the conversation. I was able to go look at their place of business in 90 seconds. Actually stand in their parking lot and assess what I could learn from that. That's a stunning amount of capability. About a year and a half ago, I was working in the Marshall Islands, and we needed to do some work on a very remote island on an atoll in the middle of the Pacific, Ebi Island on Kwajalein Atoll. And a number of people here on this call work with me on that project, and they'll remember that the image that had been done for that section of the Pacific by Google Earth was comparatively underwhelming, right? On the order of 50-meter resolution. Nothing useful in terms of the modern day. But I was able to make a couple of phone calls of the way anybody could and say, I have a reason for knowing more about this from a humanitarian perspective. Here are my credentials. Here are the people that I work with. Would you be willing to help? And within 48 hours, Google Earth had re-imaged at less than a meter resolution. And I had a much more crisp, much more accessible method for assessing what I needed to do on that island a few weeks hence. And by the way, it was tremendously helpful for the people who do the governance on that island to begin to understand where their populations actually were, where there were things happening that they had not known about, even though the island is relatively small. So from a resilience perspective, the new imaging we did on that island was relevant after the Tonga volcano eruption just 2.5 weeks ago, whatever day that was, because it was very possible the wave that killed a couple of people in Peru was going to do something at least as damaging for this 3 foot above the Pacific coral atoll. As it happens, that didn't take place. But the resilience that had been built as a consequence of 2 years ago, knowing more about the geophysical structure of their islands and the demographics that were now unfolding in the layers that could now be assessed in geospatial humanitarian sciences, meant that they were in a much better position to answer the threats that they faced. That's a kind of resilience. You mentioned WWHGD, the Worldwide Human Geography Data Working Group. That's a place that looks at human geography as a humanitarian resource, particularly around human security. It is a free and open data repository that collects from all over the place and provides to all over the place whenever it's required in an urgency. And that urgency might be locusts in East Africa. That urgency might be a Tongan volcano and what it might be doing swamping other islands. And the human geography component of that means well beyond the 2 dimensions of most geospatial information. It talks about what religions are there? Where are the schools? Where are the hospitals? When did they last have flights that arrived? What's the length of the airfield? All of the things that go into the understanding of a society and that society's ability to bounce back. So from my perspective, while what David is talking about in governance structures is absolutely right, and he and I have some fascinating conversations about what the next right best governance structure might be, he's absolutely right that there are impediments associated with the democratic republic that we have in this particular nation, and even parliamentary systems. They're still kind of unwieldy, and the speed of information in the modern day is such that an autocratic government, if a benevolent dictatorship, right? If we have Ashura, if we have Ashoka, if we have those that are anticipating only the best for their societies, could act very quickly to protect those societies in ways that were not possible 10 years ago. That does really mean that the stark difference in performance between, say, the United States and, say, our most effective peer competitor is going to be coming into relief in ways that we did not think were going to reflect negatively on us. And I think we're going to find otherwise.
And if I could real quick build on what Eric was saying. So you mentioned the example of Google Earth. there are private companies who are going online in the next 2 to 6 years with satellites able to provide with 15 minutes or less notice anywhere in the planet 2-centimeter resolution hyperspectral. And I always feel like I should pause when I say that on an open line, because I shouldn't say it on an open line, but that's commercial capability. So it's out there. You can go to their websites and find it. And they're actually able to do 1 millimeter change detection. Wow. So it's not an image, but that means you can actually see the sway of a bridge. You can see if a building is out of tolerance in advance, which is all wonderful. And that is great. But that same technology will also allow you to count cars in parking lots and predict in advance whether or not a store is doing well or not. So yes, that'll impact markets. That'll impact how hedge funds actually do their business. In fact, they already are. One of the ways that we knew about SARS-1, or otherwise referred to as atypical febrile illness back in 2003, we knew about that because increased reflectivity of cars in parking lots near hospitals in Southeast Asia told us that there was an increase of people going to the hospitals. The other way we knew was the price of garlic had gone up tenfold. At the time, those were government satellites, but they're now commercially available. And sure enough, you look at what happened with COVID-19, it happened to be that cars in parking lots shifted from factories to hospitals, and the price of garlic went up tenfold. So this does point to a new way of governing, which is if we can make that data available to everybody, we can make sense of it. But it also points to an Achilles heel, which is when you have those images available, if you're an open society that, like ours, that allows the free flow of information, including disinformation, all you have to do is the moment an actual war breaks out, you start flooding the US airways with fake photos, fake videos of what supposedly US troops are doing, and you've immediately polarized our population, and you've got the Department of Defense on their back step saying, we'll look into it, we don't think that's real, or whatever it might be, which of course the US, some population will say, we're sure they're just denying it, even if it is in fact actually true that they did not do it. Yeah. And so this is going to be a very interesting era to navigate, where we've got to figure out how to speed up open societies to be resilient to assaults on the very thing that we celebrate, which is pluralistic tolerance of different views and acceptance that we actually can come together and coexist, versus societies that are autocracies, if not in reality, autocracies in thought.
And now, David, I don't disagree with a word of that, but on the more pragmatic side, on the more practical side, we have a number of issues that we are facing as a society, as humanity, and they are the expected ones, right? We have water shortfalls, we have food insecurity, we have a number of things that are not related to the relationships we have with each other, right? Mm-hmm. These are practical things, call them planetary boundaries. In each one of them, we are learning more information about the characteristics of that problem, and out of that are coming interesting, intriguing, expansive, scalable, affordable solutions to address each one of them. So for those of us that are, have the rows of medals in the back that says, I was a ground guy, right? I was actually interacting with the population, David, just as you did in Afghanistan, but interacting, living those problems day to day. And now working with people who are coming up with more and more clever ideas to address those problems. Then we have the governance that is unwilling to implement those things for reasons that may or may not be legitimate. Can you talk for a second about how we are identifying the problems, characterizing the problems, addressing the problems with potential solutions that are scalable and affordable, and yet not acting on them because of the interests of those who have an entrenched position benefiting from the status quo?
Yes, well, and thank you for teeing that up. You mentioned I was in Afghanistan. So in 2009, after being underground for a while in Afghanistan, I ghost wrote papers for OSD that they could bury it if they didn't like, or claim they wrote it if they did. And aside from saying, I'm not sure why we're here, we should exit in 2009, conversation for another day on that. And that
you were right then too. Go ahead.
Fortunately, got buried. But I also said that we should invest in meeting people's basic needs, such as drinkable water, such as sustainable food, such as green energy. These are things that can be abundant if we did a very focused effort. And I submitted at the time that for the amount that we were spending in Afghanistan, if we spend it on this instead, it would be a wonderful exercise in soft diplomacy. It would help us in that region in terms of stabilizing, because once people's basic needs are met, they're less likely to do insurgent-like things. And it could also be things we use for natural disasters here at home and abroad. And it gets us ready for whatever climate change may bring our way. Unfortunately, they said that's too much work and that's too much money. And that was 2009, and who knows how much we spent on Afghanistan. But I raised that because you hit the nail on the head. So, again, autocratic systems without a free market can choose where they place their money, even if it's the wrong place, but they can do so in a very focused way. And again, I celebrate everything we have in the United States. I celebrate our values. I am certainly not for autocracies, but our very 2 to 4 year cycle of elections means that a politically represented elected person needs to show results in 2 to 4 years. I would submit the very problems you're talking about, Eric, those are things that are half a decade, if not a decade long in nature, and they're not going to be able to celebrate that victory in a short period of time. Same time, the free market, again, it does great things. It can actually do a lot of things efficiently. But if really what you're talking about is some benefit beyond just for profit, it's hard to motivate them. Now, that said, I am seeing some lights at the end of the tunnel, which is if you can latch into the current, again, I already submitted, we're in the period of peak virtue signaling. And so ESG has become the new blockchain of 2022. Everyone's using it. It doesn't necessarily have meaning, but there's still value in it. And so if you can motivate people to pursue green, to pursue ESG, because it leads to a halo around their stock price, or it leads to customers feeling good about that company, then you can tap into that and possibly roll out green infrastructure, potable water, sustainable food in South Africa, in South America, in Southeast Asia, which at the one hand meets people's basic needs and makes it more likely that you won't have to later do defense-related activities because you won't have the instability. So it's paying that dividend now rather than paying more later. And it just happens to be a hedge against the Belt and Road Initiative. And the reality is we need a hedge against the Belt and Road Initiative. Otherwise, there is someone that is currently spending money on that infrastructure. It's not helping the local countries, but it is helping the PRC.
That's exactly right. I was up in northern Tajikistan on a UN mission, and we left Dushanbe at the crack of dawn, right, 3:30 in the morning, and we went up and over the hills into the Zarafshan Valley. And at the top of those mountains in the pass, there were a bundle of Chinese workers building an improved road in them, basically, well, my perspective at the time, the middle of the night, and they were living up there and they were marrying local girls. That was 10 years ago, and those initiatives have expanded dramatically. Some of them have gone rather badly, but most of them have gone at least tolerably well, answering expectations on both sides. Those resource reallocations, for example, in Central Africa, are going to determine whether China can feed itself. They're going to determine whether there are civil wars in Africa as hunger continues to rise across that continent, and yet the fields in which crops are being grown, being guarded by locals from those villages, have harvests that are going to be shipped directly off the continent right into China. That's very tense. A lot of that is being monitored in ways that, as David mentions, is hyperspectral and high resolution. We know exactly what those yields are likely to be. We can do a much better job now than we could with Landsat 40 years ago. And now we're going back to Landsat, and we're able to analyze those images far better than we could before. And the comparisons are becoming rich and complicated. We are actually determining what resilience looks like in the change of yield based on alterations in agricultural practice, but not just that, often in the structures of government and how they are choosing to pursue the crops that are either good for their population or good for their own personal bank accounts while those crops are shipped elsewhere. Would you agree, David?
100%. I mean, well, it's fascinating you mentioned Landsat, because in a past life, I got called down to the principal's office in 1995. I was 17 at the time and offered a job with the Ballistic Missile Defense Organization that I couldn't tell my parents about. But, we were doing things that are now commercially available. And so I would say for STAR-TIDES, and this gets to the question that was in the chat that was asked about what could we do to actually deal with the governance issues here. I think STAR-TIDES needs to think about how do you empower interconnected local communities that deal with governance, not just of a political, social nature, but governance and cooperation with economic forces, because economic forces are the fuel in which things get done.
Mhm.
And then flow of informations, including flow of information as to what's happening at the local level in Africa, what's flowing in the local level in South America, Southeast Asia. You know, in some respects, all of these things at the end of the day are a local issue, but we need to have the ability to signal and swarm, much like how ants will swarm if any part of the colony is affected. That is the only way we're going to be able to deal with it, to still have freedoms and still have individual choice as to different contexts in which we want to live, but be able to swarm as opposed to a monolithic autocracy, which right now has the speed advantage over our more deliberative form of government.
Now,
let me,
go ahead, Aaron.
if I may, let me, a couple of things have come in the chat, I want to kind of expand on. It's tough to have these conversations without mentioning China. So I'm glad it's out there. I also have experience working in Central Asia and in Afghanistan. And I remember, you know, some names that many of us on the call will remember, Larry Wentz, and I see Jim Kraft is on here, and,
yep. Hi,
and
Jim.
Bob Ken and Larry Wentz. And I remember some of the, you know, the fiber optic technology that was being developed and the lines being laid, and you know, and how do you integrate an American or, you know, Western-based technology standard with those that were being implemented by the Chinese, right? Huawei was and ZTE were major players, and this is going back 12 years ago. I mean, this wasn't, you know, I mean, this was a long ago. So I want to kind of use that as a catalyst to the question and about the interconnectedness and standards, but also about data privacy, right? We have the data, and what policies and whose responsibility is it to both create the standards that's universal. Another hat I wore is within the ITU, Inter-Telecommunications Union, at the Geneva base of the UN, trying to create a universal standard for 5G. And because if you 4G, if any of us traveled, 4G speeds is different in the United States than certainly Japan or South Korea, where it's amazingly fast. And further, the democratization of technology was, let's create a standard of 5G. Now we're already talking about 6G, although 5G still has at least another 10 years to 15 years before full deployment. But the point is that there is a, what they call, I don't know if I agree with this term, but a new Cold War taking place. And it seems to be in a sense of technology development and deployment. So I'm asking a lot. There's been a couple of images shared about investment by the Chinese. You know, where's the hard power, the soft power? Talk about what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, with Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, Pakistan, again, the Olympics, they received a warm, you know, welcome into the stadium over a week ago. But what's the crystal ball for the two of you going forward of where the opportunities lie in resilience and interconnectedness, but also where the danger lies and where we should be mindful of where those pitfalls and those risks lie in going forward. David, to you first, and then Eric.
So while I might say we're in the middle of a cognitive Cold War plural with multiple entities, I would not say we're in a Cold War with China, because we are much more tightly coupled, economically integrated with China and the United States than we ever were with the Soviet Union. And in fact, I would submit we don't want to fully decouple from China, because we're all going to be worse off if that's the case. And then there really is no disincentive for things not to get hot. Whereas if you are economically coupled, things are okay. Now, in terms of the battle of standards, it is very much the case that China is trying to buy off votes in the ITU. That's actually what makes ITU a little bit challenging, because it's every nation gets a vote, including some of the small ones. And if China says, you know, here's a grant or a funding of $500,000, then you could influence what the ITU puts out. I would actually say in some respects, though, the speed at which technology is being democratized makes standards organizations with some regards less important now, because of the speed at which things are coming. By the time a standards organization comes out with a standard, things will have already moved on. And you don't see any of the innovators in the space or in the data or the tech space pushing for standards, because right now they feel like that would actually slow down their speed of innovation. Now that said, future of China. and the United States. I would say recognize China's had 4 revolutions in 3,000 years. None of those revolutions left them better off. Their narrative around revolutions is the exact opposite of the United States, which was revolution for us was a glorious thing. It gave birth to us. The one time we had a civil war, it was only 4 years, which was relatively short compared to the time when China had civil wars that lasted 100 years or more. And our civil war, we emerged ultimately stronger and the union remained intact. And so we have a completely different narrative in some respects over revolutions than China does. We also don't have 1.2 billion people. I am not condoning what they do, but I think the goal should not be to have this devolve into a trade war or much worse, a kinetic war, but to figure out how we can influence through various means them adopting norms that are more consistent with the norms that we want US and Europe to embrace. That's what we really should be trying to do. That said, I am surprised, no, actually, I'm not surprised that Europe's General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, which is being violated on a daily basis by China, which says all your data must be viewable to the government. Somehow Europe is not fining China. Somehow Europe is not calling China on the phone saying we've got an issue here. And of course, you know why, because if Europe had to, you already see where countries that call that call China out, which would be Exhibit A, Australia. Australia is in a war at the moment with China. Basically, if you don't know already, in the last year, all of the government agencies in Australia have been compromised, including their defense. There are economic sanctions, both visible and not, and boycott of Australian industry by China. And there is active disinformation being spread in Australia. That's DIME, diplomacy, information, military, economic. And so we are not calling what Australia and China is engaged in a war because that would be inconvenient. But when you scratch your head and wonder why all of a sudden Australia feels the need to have nuclear powered submarines, maybe there's a reason. So I would say, our goal with China should be find opportunities for engagement, whether it's through state to state, whether it's through NGO to NGO, industry to industry, to try and understand how we can positively shape, as well as maybe negatively shape, the incentives so that they adopt norms that are more like us, but recognize, again, they've been around for 3,000 years. Their narrative on revolution is the exact opposite of ours. In fact, they're probably very worried that with Evergreen, the fact that their markets are about 60% dependent on construction, they are probably worried that their West will rise up against their East and they'll have revolution number 5, which we in the United States may not really want, because here's a country that has nuclear warheads. And if the military takes control, you may end up with something worse off than what you have right now. Now, Russia, I'll be very brief because I want to make sure Eric can chime in too. I would say, while everyone's focusing on the Ukraine, and Ukraine is very bad, we seem to have forgotten what happened in Kazakhstan. And here's what I would say about Kazakhstan, which was March of 2021. Russia went to the Minister of Interior for Kazakhstan and said, we'd like to renew some of the rocket launch facilities that we have in your country. We had a 30-year lease, we want to renew it again. Kazakhstan said no, because they had a deal with the UAE that wanted to actually renew those rocket launch facilities. Remembering UAE has actually successfully launched a rocket and sent a probe to Mars. Russia doesn't like it when someone says no to them. June, all of a sudden, the price of processed liquid natural gas doubles. Why does that matter? Well, one, the only place where Kazakhstan can get processed liquid natural gas from is Russia. And it turns out their cars, which are for the middle class, are $4,000 a pop. They're not great cars, but they're built in Russia and they run off liquid natural gas. So when you double the price, you're hitting the middle class very hard in the gut. And then finally, for those of you that have been to former Soviet republics, gun ownership is very low. To find people with guns is very rare. Somehow, however, when the supposed coup occurs, there are plenty of people with guns as well as with bombs, which again, someone had to supply them. And the last thing I would say on that case is, with less than 48 hours notice, despite everything that was going on in Ukraine, Russia miraculously had 82 planes fully equipped with troops and material ready to go into Kazakhstan, when it would probably take them about 9 months to get ready for that. What happened 9 months ago? Oh, wait, someone said no to Russia about the space launch facilities. And now the Minister of Interior is imprisoned. Russia has their person on the stage. They have ownership of those space launch facilities. They have ownership of the natural gas, the energy. West is all focusing on Ukraine because that has a border with Europe. Kazakhstan, on the other hand, rhymes with Afghanistan, which is negative in the US's mind. We seem to have missed what really may have happened. Now, I would say Putin is probably worried that he's getting old. He has no succession plan in place. He knows that when he is appearing to be weak, he will be overthrown. So at some point in time, he's probably figuring out what is his exit strategy, where he will go to a country and say, if you give forgiveness for all my sins, I will now turn over the keys and leave. Now, of course, you'll be left with trying to reconstruct Russia. So I would say our game there should be, we should get Silicon Valley to say, we want physicists, we want engineers, we want mathematicians. Russia, you have plenty of those, but we can't work with you because of your current regime. If your regime is to change, we want to invest in you. And then we just leave it at that. But that's how I would approach it. And I realize I'm an unconventional thinker that oftentimes gets tossed out the room because people don't want to hear what I have to say.
No, we appreciate what you're saying now. Eric, we've got, we are coming up on time, but I do want to give you, and I think we can go over our allotted time. We're at 43 past the hour. But I do want to kind of give you a chance to get the last word in, respond accordingly, and then I'll conclude today's session with a couple of announcements. But go ahead, Eric.
That sounds fine. Thank you. And I'll be brief. Number one, the US, the Biden administration has just like 2 weeks ago, released our Indo-Pacific Strategy. It's 29 pages. It mentions climate a dozen times, and we are beginning to alter the way we are positioning ourselves as a leader on the world stage. We are reassuming the mantle of guidance, of leadership, of a progressive understanding of the threats that humanity faces. That's good. That's particularly important for the Western Pacific, where much of the encirclement strategy that China is worried about is taking place. We don't perceive it like that, but if you actually draw a map of US or US friendly nations in let's call them hemispheres around China, moving toward the west coast of the United States, you'll find that there are overlapping circles that China worries a great deal about and finds their credibility challenged, yet to them it's quite obvious. It helps to look at what we are choosing to do to mitigate some of the threat perception and at the same time strengthen the US's position on many of those Pacific Island states. I think it was Stavridis that came out with 2034, the novel 6 months ago, that was serialized in Wired magazine. I recommend it to all of you because it talks about how to accidentally back into a war that nobody wants with China in the modern day. It's set about 12, 15 years from now. And it's a plausible story, and it involves a lot of technology, a lot of diplomacy that is routine day to day, but not commonly seen by those that are not involved with those. And it's worth assessing what the risks might actually be and whether anybody on this call might have the skills to help mitigate the risks that we currently face. And last, in looking at governance, in looking at what the right way to approach the effectiveness, the apparent effectiveness of an autocratic government that does worry a lot about heads on pikes because their revolutions have gone so badly in the past, right? The Chinese government knows full well that if their population rises against them, none of them will last more than 24 hours. So how do you keep your population happy? Well, there are a number of ways to do that. And to look at the ethics of governance. And we had that mentioned a couple of times. Jim mentioned it, Jim Kraft mentioned it, and Reed mentioned it. We've a book that David just brought out yesterday with, I think, Divya Chandra. Yep. That book talks about ethics at work. And I've had a chance to begin reading it, and the strategies that are offered there, the examples that are offered there, work on the large scale, not just the small. So it's not just the kind of corporate thing that I would see here in a company like mine, but on the world stage, how we look at behavior in governmental structures that interact with one another. And I recommend it to you. I'd stop there. Aaron, back to you.
Well, thank you for all that. And I'll conclude with a couple of quick announcements. We will have, again, this is our first event. Our second event is scheduled for Tuesday, March 17th from 4 to 4:45 Eastern time. featuring Mei-Lin Feng. She is the chair and co-founder of People-Centered Internet, an organization based in Palo Alto, California. It should be a very interesting conversation from Mei-Lin's perspective on the topic we'll continue with. And so want to leave it at that. Want to thank our speakers, David, Eric. I think this was a great conversation. Both of you leave us with some great insights. But I think what's important, the key takeaway, and this is, you know, maybe obvious, but I'm surprised it's not obvious to everyone, is that we really need to find some kind of mutual understanding and asking the key questions going forward. There's the internet in this general sense has allowed us to be to get a lot of information quickly. But as we've learned, and again, without naming names, whether it's in the United States or in other countries, we learned that disinformation has become such a powerful force. And I want to be mindful of that. And now we'll start the conversation next month about how do we deal with disinformation and the impact on the people. So thank you, everyone. Thank you for your time, and we'll conclude it today. Have a great day.
Good talk. Thanks very much. Corinne, it was good to see you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Aaron.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Eric.